Once I met a girl lost in a book, dreaming the past. Follow, she said, and jumped in a page. She smiled and she asked. Walked to Glenfinnan, waited with Charlie. We drank an old leaf, we were toasted by Robbie. We stood as they signed in our broth at the Abbey. She took me to places that I never thought you could see.
Hi, I'm Jenny, and this is the second offering from Random Scottish History for Independence Live, and today we're talking potatoes, and were a lack of potatoes the main reason that Scots absconded in their droves from the end of the 18th into the mid-19th century. An event known as the clearances. It's tempting to call them the Highland clearances, and while they truly devastated the Highlands, the depopulation was near complete. This was something that happened over the whole extent of Scotland. All of the rural areas were really part of this change of life for people. So lots of families used to live in quite close communities on lands called runrigs, which were small tracts of lands held for maybe 7 years or so, just short leases. And the rent for these tracts of land were paid in goods or services. So you would pay X amount, ball, weight, barrel of whatever produce you were able to put together, or maybe ploughing or seeding X amount of acreage owned by your landowner. So it was fairly reciprocal, but this changed in the mid-18th century into the crofter system, where these small tracts of lands were combined into larger plots, crofts or farms, held instead by one family or one tenant farmer, and these were no longer paid for in goods and services. These were now paid for in hard cash. So whatever you could produce from the land now went towards paying your rent and paying your way. So a lot of land that used to house many families were now occupied by one family or one farmer and a lot of sheep or cattle. The owners of the land then began to take more control over it in something they called the improvements, where lots of roads were built, and the land was put to a different purpose than formerly. So whole swathes of forest, rivers and moors were no longer accessible to the population that formerly resided there and lived from these places. These were now the resort of the landowners and their rich friends, who would use them as sports grounds or hunting grounds for fishing and shooting of deer, grouse, whatever. And they didn't want to see poor people roaming about trying to get from A to B or working, or they wanted the place to themselves now, and they had the ability to go ahead and do that. So the people now were targeted if they were found in these areas, because they couldn't be there for any good reason, surely. They were obviously seeking to poach from the landowner. Nature's bounty was now under lock and key. So Punch magazine, a particularly Anglo-centric London-based publication whose biases extend to everyone that's not a white Protestant English male. They came out with a rather interesting article dated December of 1857. It was called Hookie Mac Walker's Conscience. And in this article, it states, "Besides, there are hardly any Highlanders now except deer, the Dukes having driven almost all the men out of the glens." Pretty sure the Dukes, who were trying very hard to shake the depopulating tag that had been assigned to them during this period, I'm pretty sure they didn't enjoy the blasé outing of what they were trying very hard to keep secret. I'm pretty sure as well, though, that they would have seen Punch magazine as fairly inaccessible to your bog standard Scot, so maybe they didn't think that information would get anywhere. It was an open secret, but these dukes and lords and landowners, they would write open letters to newspapers in a bid to divert attention from them, or to justify what they'd done, or to just outright deny that what was happening with the extirpation of the population was happening at all. Fortunately, there were people willing to counter those arguments in other open letters, which make for excellent reading. So, we'll get into the articles a wee bit. We're going to, like I say, focus on the potato famine version of events. It's so widely spread as fact in school history lessons, in some of the books I've read. Sometimes you'll see it in a documentary. These historians on TV basically just still acting as apologists for these land clearing authorities. So in a bid to disabuse folk of the belief that it was an extended crop or potato famine which was the cause of these extensive emigrations and extirpations of the people from varying vast stretches of Scottish lands, I've gone through the papers, and the full information, like everything, is available in posts that I'll post to rsh.scot. It'll be in pieces because there's a lot of information. We're not really going to get into it too much on this episode. We don't have the time for it. So we're told by clearance apologists that the Highlands were apparently starving for decades, that crops were failing for decades. The land just couldn't support the people. They had to leave, and they weren't being forced to. They were choosing to. They weren't happy at home anymore. Their country was no longer supporting them and their families, so they felt in themselves that they had to leave, Now in 1800 and 1801, these years were termed the dear years. Because food was scarce, you had people like Lord Warwick in the papers, the Caledonian Mercury in particular, for the 11th of December 1800, claiming that farmers were withholding their stores in order to raise the prices of their produce, that instead of producing 100 acres of food, enough to feed everyone, they were only producing 50 acres of food, say, so that food was scarcer and therefore more expensive, and they were making more money. He felt like the farmers weren't getting their thumbs out, which just wasn't the case. We know that in hindsight. We call these years the dear years, and they were particularly hard on the people, and they were outliers. So Lord Warwick was not correct in the fact that his bread was so expensive because the farmers were doing anything wrong. The harvests had just failed, as could be expected every so often. Then in 1804 they had another bad year. In 1809, we had another bad year. In 1812, there was a partial failure of the harvest. In 1816, there was also a partial failure of the harvest, but we're told that it wasn't particular to the British mainland, including England and Wales. The continent had suffered as well in food production for 1816, but we were able to make it up from other areas. In 1821, it was a particularly bad year for crops, as far as I could tell. In 1822, the Highlands were suffering from a particular dearth of food, but then it's not until 1833 that we have another partial failure. In 1835, we have a partial failure, and we're hearing that disease is threatening the potato crop. So rather than it being adverse weather or soil conditions, now disease is making its inroads. 1836, we have a partial failure. They're worried about disease again. In 1837, we're told that families are eating grain for longer than normal in order to cover themselves for a late harvest, etc. That there are people struggling in 1837 to feed themselves. But 1836 and 1837 were particularly hard years in the fact that the Highland Distress Committee, the Highland Destitution Committee had got together to try and raise charitable funds in order to help the people. And in 1837, we're told by the Inverness Courier for the 2nd of August, 1837, at a public meeting of the tenants, lotters and cotters of the parish of Durness in county of Sutherland, held this day, the following resolutions were severally moved and unanimously adopted. 1. That while this parish, in common with many other districts in the Highlands, was threatened with famine, owing to the great deficiency of the late harvest, this meeting expressed the high and grateful feeling they entertain of Her Grace the Duchess Countess of Sutherland's benevolent and generous regard for their destitute condition in sending a large donation of meal to the poor and necessitous in the parish, as an ample supply of seed corn, potatoes, and meal to the tenants at large, both timiously furnished and judiciously distributed, and which, under Providence, proved the means of arresting the threatened calamity. Now we're going to be returning to this particular article, because how amazing is that the Duchess Countess of Sutherland is literally going out her way to say that, yes, everywhere is suffering just now, the people are really struggling, and while you are raising charity for all of these other areas, don't worry about raising charity for my area of Sutherland. I have it. I'm on it. I've got it under control. I'm feeding the people. I'm making sure that my tenants and the people on my land are taken care of. And how amazing is that? Then we have 1840, and again, we're looking at partial failures. So where some areas are failing, other areas are able to make up for it. 1841, we have the same. 1846, the same. There's dearth in some areas. Other areas are making up for it. Potatoes, we're hearing, are coming up diseased more often. But we're also able to make up for a substantial amount of our failed harvests from the free trade that we were happy to have with European countries and the Americas, so that corn could be imported and varying grains could be imported in order to make up for any failures. We're hearing about some of the diseases that are affecting potatoes. People aren't entirely sure where this is coming from or how to stop it as yet. 1847, It's not great. Again, we have the Central Board for Relief coming into play. We're being told that they have resolutions from a meeting. One, that the funds was raised and entrusted to the management of the Central Board for the relief of the destitution in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, produced by the failure of the potato crop of 1846, and therefore that it is the duty of the Board to apply the fund for the relief of destitution there, as long as it is produced by the operation of that cause, and that they are not entitled to divert the balance of the fund to any other purpose. Now, we know that there were lords obtaining this money illicitly. They weren't putting it to the purpose it was meant for. It wasn't going to relieve the people of their hunger. It was going to assuage the costs of putting them on boats, because that cost landowners money that they weren't entirely happy to spend. So we're told at the end by one of the lords that he agrees with the reasons for the committee having been got together. He agrees wholeheartedly that this money should be going purely to the people that deserve it. He says that for the reasons stated in that report, and altogether irrespective of the partial failure of the potato crop this year and the lateness of the harvest, he was of the opinion that a similar want must be expected to occur in the West Highlands and Islands of Shetland, as a direct consequence of the failure of the potato crop of last year. Farther, that the renewal of the extraordinary measures of relief alone could prevent the extreme misery of the people. He referred to the allusion to the Drainage Act, where it was remarked that the sum that could be made available to crofters was small. This was a mistake, for in many cases the proprietors had got large sums. Neither did he think it would be a legitimate application of the fund to bestow it on improving the land, as that would assuredly lead to the increasement of rent. And he was entirely right. People were not keeping up with the speed at which rent was increasing. Now, we been uploading the introduction, the extensive introduction to the Gazetteer of Scotland 1847 recently, and I posted a quote to Twitter that really struck me, and it was that between the periods of 1660 to the period that the Gazetteer was coming out in 1847, so not quite 200 years, but 190 years, rents across the parishes of Scotland as a whole had increased by approximately 2,000% in this period of time. The people were expected to keep up with that. And it was obviously not going to be the ability of everyone to be able to maintain the life they had prior to these huge increases due mainly to these landowner improvements. So we'll go in for 1848. We have another partial failure. They actually give a list of all the individual areas that are affected and to what extent they're affected. In 1849, 50, 51 and 52, again, we have varying reports. In some areas, crops are luxuriant, they're coming up great, there's very little disease being found, though not none, whereas other areas are really struggling and trying to raise as much as possible, but, you know, they're coming up against hard times, but it keeps balancing itself out to some extent, and where it fails to balance itself out, importation increases from abroad. In 1853, we're told that there's no sign of disease in a lot of areas, that they seem to be overcoming it. But 1854, we find that the potato crop is extensively diseased throughout all the west coast. There's coming and going. There are reports where potatoes that were diseased to the point where they weren't even lifted out of the ground actually then produced quite a good crop the following year, just having been left in the ground. That seemed to happen on occasions. So if your crop failed and was diseased, it wasn't necessarily the end of the road for that crop, so to speak. There seemed to be zombie crops on the go, recovering from prior death by disease. So the Glasgow Courier for October of 1855 gives us another one of these lists of what's going on in the different areas. And I'll read this one as an example of the others. We have Aberdeenshire, potatoes a good crop with little disease. Argyllshire, potatoes rather a failure. Ayrshire, potato crop the best seen since 1844. Berwickshire, potato crop highly promising though not free from disease. Dumbartonshire, potatoes much blighted but the tubers not affected to any great extent, about an eighth. Dumfriesshire, potatoes slightly affected but the crop the best since 1845. East Lothian, potatoes one of the best and largest ever grown in the district. Fifeshire, potatoes a large crop and not much diseased. Forfarshire, potatoes promise an abundant crop and little disease. Inverness-shire, potatoes fine in quality and little disease. Kinross-shire, potato crop never more promising. Kincardineshire, the potato crop partially diseased, the tubers small. Kirkcudbrightshire, potatoes tainted by disease but not to any great extent. Lanarkshire, potatoes the finest crop for the last 10 years. Linlithgowshire, potato crop a large one with little disease. Midlothian, potatoes fine crop. Morayshire, potatoes a good crop with partial disease but not very extensively planted. Nairnshire, potato crop very abundant and little disease. Peeblesshire, potatoes slightly diseased. Perthshire, potatoes partially diseased. Renfrewshire, the potato crop is the best for many years as regards quantity and quality. Rossshire, the potato crop large and quality fine. Roxboroughshire, potatoes a splendid crop and little or no disease. Selkirkshire, potatoes an abundant crop but diseased. Sutherlandshire, potatoes a good crop. Wigtonshire, the potato disease very severe. So you see how much of a mixed bag that is, and that's the case for most years. There wasn't really general failures across the whole place. They happened very rarely, as you've seen. So 1856, 1857, mixed bag again. Things seem to be looking up though. 1858 was, again, a mixed bag. There were partial failures around the place. 1859, everything seems like there was never a problem. Things are looking great. We've got the Edinburgh Evening Courant telling us potato crop in the north. We have reports from all the northern counties as to the potato crop, and in almost every case they are found free of disease, while universally they are a good crop and of the very finest quality, although unfortunately there is not a great breadth planted this year. Peterhead Sentinel, General Advertiser for the Buchan District, potatoes are a fair crop in most places and excellent in quality. The Banffshire Journal, potatoes are a splendid crop, fresh and of excellent quality in Rathen. In New Pitsligo, the potato crop is rich, fresh and of excellent quality. Culsalmond, potatoes are excellent and free from taint. 1859 is a good year for the people. So what these articles show is that dearth was a possibility for most years, not just in Scotland, across England, across the rest of the mainland, Ireland especially, which is a slightly different case, and across the European continent. There was just dearth occasionally. The people didn't freak out about it. They were very pragmatic about their situation, and they made do as they had done on former years. Fortunately, crop failures, they could be made up by importation from places that weren't suffering the same failures. And this is just a really good example of where free trade on the global marketplace benefited us and kept the shelves stocked and the food prices low enough that the people were able to do for themselves. We can see as well that there were articles for farmers, practical farmers, to experiment with their land. There was prize money put up for people to write essays and try and discover reasons for disease, cures for disease, for insect infestations. They wanted to know how to better their agriculture. And so they would do competitions and things in a bid to solve some problems. So we have an example of this. So for 1800, the Caledonian Mercury has: the Highland Society of Scotland do hereby advertise that they are to give the undermentioned premiums for raising an early crop of potatoes in the year 1800. The Highland Society being desirous to promote, as much as in its power, every measure tending to prevent the continuance of the evils which have been occasioned by the failure of last crop, has lately addressed to its members and the public some directions respecting the selection of seed corns for the ensuing season, accompanied by a warm recommendation of an increased and earlier plantation of potatoes. So they're suggesting that if you're prepared to plant earlier, then they're prepared to give you a grant to do so. We have Sir John Sinclair in the Scots Magazine of 1813 making the same call for early planting. The Scotsman of 1818 says: a general failure of the crops of an extensive kingdom is a calamity that but seldom occurs. The weather that is unfavourable to vegetation in one species of soil is frequently favourable to it in another. If moist clay lands suffer from a wet summer, the crops are rendered more luxuriant in dry rocky districts. So it's showing that you don't have to fear, there's always going to be a way for the people to subsist. So that's an article that's obviously out to put people's minds at rest to a certain degree. It actually states: a freedom of trade is alone wanted to guarantee a country like Britain, abounding in all the varied products of industry, in merchandise suited to the wants of every society, from the possibility of a scarcity. So they're just reiterating what I said before. Free trade was what kept food on the table, really. The Inverness Courier for 1827 has an actually really interesting article on how converting your potatoes into potato flour helps to preserve them, which was very important. The preservation of food was a long-running battle with people in order to make a thing last as long as possible. And potatoes not only offering so much food from a smaller amount, they could be preserved so much easier by turning it into potato flour, which could then be used as any other flour was used. So it made it so much more of a utility vegetable. And this person is telling people how to go about it in the easiest fashion. And really promoting it as a way not only of preserving the food, but of making better use of the vegetable. We have one of these practical farmers for the Inverness Courier of August 1833 talking about his experiences and the different ways that he's planted his crops, the different uses he's made of the manure, etc., what he's used to make up the manure. He's wanting to lay out what has and hasn't worked so that others can learn from his successes and failures, which is important and likely helped out a number of people at the time it was published. The Scotsman for February of 1834 is one of these kind of competitions. It says: a partial failure having taken place in the potato crop of last year, the Society hereby offers a premium of 10 sovereigns for the best essay on the nature and causes of the injury or disease, and on the best means of preventing or palliating it in future. Candidates are further required to examine the state of the growing plants in the present year, and to observe with care whether any or similar insects attack the sets, under what circumstances of soil or culture they appear to prevail, and generally to state their opinions as to the cause of the disease or injury, and by means of remedy. The winner there would have produced an essay that likely would have been very beneficial in the spreading of information for what would have worked and what wouldn't have worked in terms of securing a good potato harvest and trying to discern the cause of the failures that were being experienced. I remember being taught in school that land didn't seem to be farmed properly by the population of the time. That the potato famine began because the crops were going black and gloopy in the ground, and that it seemed to convey the idea that the Scottish farming population hadn't learned or progressed their agriculture. Of course they knew these things. Of course they were on top of agriculture. It was how the people mainly lived. You have in a lot of the reports of the experimenters that their fields could be under barley, then under grass for 2 years, and then potatoes put in, and then they've turned out okay. Or there's lots of different ways in which the idea that the farming population weren't on top of things is just wrong. One of the main ones that I found was actually an article that had come out for the Random Scottish History series of newspaper article Lucky Dips that we're doing at the moment. So in 1857, a Scotsman called John Kyle from Clydeview in Partick near Glasgow, he was awarded 10,000 francs by the French. The reason that he was awarded this enormous sum of money was because the French and Spanish vineyards had been suffering from failures and disease for a while, and they could not get on top of it. They did not know what to do to solve this problem. John Kyle had suggested adding sulphur to the soil, and the English were told, just laughed at him and derided his ideas. They suggested that he was an idiot, basically, didn't know what he was talking about. He had responded to them with the standard facts or chills that win a ding, and it turns out that his idea was the only one that had served to prevent this disease in the French and Spanish vineyards. And by saving the French wine industry, the French government awarded him 10,000 francs. Ireland was a different case, though. It wasn't as if the press were uncomfortable with printing the existence of death by famine and the extent of suffering that it could bring, and disease and hardship. You didn't get in the Scottish papers about Scotland nearly the kind of reports that were coming out of Ireland. The reports from Ireland really made you feel for the population of the time. I mean, they were just between a rock and a hard place. Sectarianism played a huge part, where the people in authority were in the main Protestants by this time, and the mainly Catholic working class of Ireland were done out of all kinds of areas of employment because the Protestants weren't prepared to have anything to do with them. So a lack of employment, along with potato failures and disease and what have you, just served to create a far worse situation in Ireland. We have articles like this from the Perthshire Courier from May 1822. In the counties of Kerry, Limerick, Galway, Mayo and Clare, the peasantry are suffering under a deplorable want of food, and to accumulate their sufferings, the typhus fever has made its appearance among them. Limerick, our hearts bleed within us at the terrific aspect before us of scarcity. Potatoes are at present almost at a famine price. The Limerick paper contains the names of 70 men who have absconded from their residences in that county and have thereby rendered themselves liable to the penalties of the Insurrection Act, which was an act very similar to the Act of Prescription after the civil wars of 1715 and 1745 in Scotland, and they even had their own version of the Duke of Cumberland in the form of the two-faced Henry Luttrell. The Dublin papers received this morning contain further details of the great misery existing in consequence of the failure of the potato crop. In the county of Kerry, not 1/4 of the usual quantity of ground has been planted with potatoes, the poor landlords having been obliged to consume those they had allotted for seed. To consummate the misery of the unfortunate sufferers, disease, the constant follower of famine, has made its appalling appearance. A fever of typhus kind, of the most malignant character, has broken out in Galway, and each day records some death after a short illness. There are a lot of articles in the same vein, just about famine raging, disease raging amongst the population of Ireland, and how there was abundance still. There wasn't a good reason that it was manufactured, this situation in Ireland. It was manufactured by political feelings more than it was by crop failures. However, along with that, the John O'Groat Journal for January of 1839 tells us that they had something else to contend with. Ireland has been the chief victim of the hurricane. Every part of Ireland, every field, every town, every village in Ireland has felt its dire effects. From Galway to Dublin, from the Giant's Causeway to the island of Valencia, it has been, we repeat it, the most awful, the most extraordinary calamity of the kind with which a people were afflicted. The damage which it has done is almost beyond calculation. Several hundreds of thousands of trees have been levelled to the ground. More than half a century must elapse before Ireland, in this regard, presents the appearance she did last summer. The loss of farming stock of all kinds has been terrible. Many of the most thrifty and industrious husbandmen, whose haggards and homesteads were filled with unthreshed corn on Sunday night, found themselves without a sheaf of grain in the morning. The poor, of course, as being the most numerous, have been the greatest sufferers. Tens of thousands of their wretched cabins have been swept away or unroofed, and many, as we have seen, have become prey to the flames. On the whole, however, there has not been so great a loss of life as might have been anticipated. But you can see that on top of everything else is just going to have served to make things so much worse. The Evening Chronicle for February 1847 tells us that there's been a spread of fever. We never recollect to hear of this infectious disease being so prevalent as at the present moment. In our poor house in particular, it is alarmingly increasing, and the paupers are falling victims to its influence. Within the last week, the schoolmistress, a respectable female, was attacked by this disease, and the medical attendant, whose duties of late have been so arduous, is lying while we write. Really, before long, if the disease spreads as it has done within the past fortnight, the institution will be one vast lazar house. On Tuesday, in consequence of the increasing spread of fever in the workhouse, guardians were afraid to enter the institution, and their meeting was, in consequence, held in the town hall. So that's again just showing that disease is a big part of the problem for the people in Ireland. Now, I mentioned about it being manufactured, this problem in Ireland, and a lot of it was to do with land rights. So a landowner would sublet his land to, say, X amount of people in different lots. They would then sublet to different people. They would then sublet. So you ended up with these tiers of people all expecting to make a profit from their lets, which meant that the prices of property skyrocketed just far beyond the reach of your average man on the street. The North British Agriculturist for October of 1851 explains this to us a wee bit using an example of Lord Audley's estate. Most of our readers will remember the harrowing accounts which were given of the distress existing in 1846 in Ireland. In no place was this greater than the district of Skibbereen. The mortality from fever and famine was quite fearful. The district is stated to have been bordering on destitution ever since, and that this year a considerable number will die of starvation unless aided by a grant either through private benevolence or from government. The latter may not be readily granted, though, particularly from the agitation at present raised against the repayment of the previous loan. The following paper by Hancock shows that the distress of 1846, though greatly increased by the potato rot, was connected with causes of a more permanent nature, and consequently the comparative absence of the potato disease for the past few years has done little to improve the condition of the people and to prepare them for another visitation. Was the distress entirely caused by the potato failure? This depended on the question, what was the state of the Skibbereen district before 1846? The Times Commissioner had visited it in 1845 and described the people as being then in the most abject state of destitution. Hence it followed that the real sources of the calamities which the people suffered were the distress and wretched system of agriculture which prevailed before the famine. Had the people not been reduced to the verge of starvation, had their wages not been at the lowest point consistent with human existence before that time, the failure of the potato would, as in other districts, have caused privation only, and not death. The facts respecting this district he had collected from a petition in the case of the late Lord Audley in the Encumbered Estates Court. The Audley estate included a large tract of land lying between Scull and Skibbereen. The entire of this estate was held by middlemen whose lease would expire in 1854, so that in 1845 and 1846 no occupier had any interest exceeding 9 years in the land, so that neither middlemen nor occupiers were able to improve the estate. As to the interest of the head landlord, it appeared that as far back as 1829 the encumbrances on the Audley estate had far exceeded its value, being £25,000 on a rental of less than £600 a year. That they increased rapidly so as to amount to £89,400 exclusive of interest and law costs at Lord Audley's death in 1837, and that the interest and law costs increased the charges against the property in 1846 to the enormous amount of £167,300 on a rental of £577 a year. It appeared that from Lord Audley's death in 1837 to the present hour, instead of there being one landlord to deal with the property, there were 80 encumbrances whose consent was necessary to enable anything to be done. So you can see there how greed has manufactured that situation for the people of Skibbereen, and greed was really the root cause of a lot of our problems. What other reasons might people have been leaving their homes and country? Did the papers perhaps help us to discover what, if not the potatoes, were the reason for people leaving? Yes they did. A lot. The Inverness Courier for November of 1837 has, after tracing the immediate cause of the destitution to the failure of the two crops of 1835 and 1836, Mr. Graham observes that the country is in a state of great impoverishment and misery, the grand cause of which he considers to be that the population has been allowed to increase in a much greater ratio than the means of subsistence which it affords. In order to do away with the overpopulation, Mr. Graham proposes various remedies. First, by educating the people. What has already been done, he observes, for the Highlands in the establishment of schools cannot be too much applauded, and can scarcely be too forcibly recommended to the attention of government to be continued systematically as the best and surest foundation for any internal cure which can now be operated, of the present disproportion between the population of these districts and their means of employment. Second, by obtaining employment for the surplus population in the manufactories in the great towns or in establishing works for them near their own houses. Third, by constructing roads in judicious lines through the country whereby they would be employed. But Mr. Graham considers the encouragement of emigration to be the most effectual remedy for the evil which forms the subject of his report. The most effectual mode of preventing a recurrence of the present distress, and one which was suggested everywhere as being almost a necessary remedy, would be by emigration. To whatever extent in other ways employment can be found, emigration in one shape or another must continue to take place. Probably it would in the long run be the most expedient, the most efficient, and the most economical expenditure of the public money if Her Majesty's Government were to assist in establishing a system of emigration on a great scale. To give effectual relief, it must be done generally and on a great scale. If it is done partially and to a small extent, the relief will not be recognised. Well, doesn't that just sound like he just wants to get rid of the people? to qualify his sentiments on Scotland being overpopulated and emigration being key to lessening the distress of the people due to this overpopulation, let me just give you the numbers. So in 1840, the population of England and Wales was approximately 15.9 million people, contained within its combined 58,355 square miles, which gives us 272.5 people to the square mile. That is a lot of people to the square mile. To Scotland's 2.6 million of a population at the same time, within its 30,415 square miles, or 85.5 people to the square mile, or almost 2/3 less of a population than our sister countries. So yeah, overpopulation. The Glasgow Herald for August of 1826 tells us, "It is true the emigrations carried into effect in 1823 and 1825 under the superintendence of Mr. Peter Robinson in Ireland were supported by parliamentary grants of money, for which no repayment was pledged, but those emigrations were necessary for the purpose of experiment, and the justification of employing public money for that purpose was specially pleaded, on the ground of there being experiments which were necessary to precede any more extended scheme. The principal, if not the only objections which were raised against these experiments, rested on the ground of the expenditure of public money, which they involved being repaid. It is at once evident that this system of emigration could be made immediately applicable to Ireland and Scotland, provided that money was raised there for the purpose by local assessment, and that a specific tax was pledged for money lent for that purpose by the government. The mode in which this may be done is pointed out, and it is shown that parishes in England and proprietors of land in Scotland and Ireland are interested in contributing to the removal of unemployed labourers from a part of the empire where they endured distress and constitute weakness to other parts where they may maintain themselves, and add to the strength and security of our foreign possessions. But this was not borne out as it was to come to pass. Again, in the Round of Scottish History newspaper article Lucky Dips, we had an article that really showed the extent of how freaked out the British politicians and authorities were getting at the escape of their labouring populations. So in January of 1874, the Edinburgh Evening News tells us the fact that since May 1851, more than 2.25 million of emigrants have left the shores of Ireland is surely sufficient to attract serious attention to the question of the exodus going forward from that country. Were this tide of emigration directed to some portion of our own empire, the state of matters would not be so serious as it is. The United States, however, and not Canada or Australia, absorb by far the majority of those who leave the Emerald Isle to seek their fortune abroad. Until the emigration from the United Kingdom is directed to our own colonies, and not to the territory of some other power, the continual drain going forward from our empire is matter for national regret. How to direct the stream of emigration from its present course is a problem for patriotic politicians. These same politicians were not helping the Irish. They weren't helping the destitute from Ireland or Scotland. Why would these people want to go to other British possessions in order that their labour might still be able to fill Westminster's coffers? I can't believe they would have felt any loyalty in that direction whatsoever. If we go back to the Irish question, just to elaborate on the point made about why they might not have loyalty, the Arbroath Guide for February of 1848 gives us a report from the House of Commons. Mr. Scully, in the absence of Mr. O'Connell, wished to ask whether, considering the enormous and everyday growing increase of destitution in many parts of Ireland, the government had not some measure ready for the providing of relief by means of food or employment. Sir G. Grey complained of the inconvenience attending upon putting questions of this nature, involving considerations of the whole question of the state and condition of Ireland, at so short a notice. Hear, hear. He would, however, state, for the satisfaction of the honourable member, that the government were not prepared to bring in any measure for the resumption of the public works in Ireland. Neither were they prepared to propose any measure to feed the whole of the destitute poor of that country. So tell me again why they would have had any loyalty and wanted to go to Canada or Australia in order to help Britain with their labour. The Edinburgh Witness for August of 1843 says, "Let us follow for a little the poor Highlanders of Sutherland to the sea coast. It would be easy dwelling on the terrors of their expulsion and multiplying facts of horror, but had there been no permanent deterioration effected in their condition, these, all harrowing and repulsive as they were, would have mattered less. Sutherland would have soon recovered the burning up of a few hundred hamlets, or the loss of a few bedridden old people, who would have died as certainly under cover, though perhaps a few months later, as when exposed to the elements in the open air. Nay, had it lost 1,000 of its best men, in the way in which it lost so many at the storming of New Orleans, the blank ere now would have been completely filled up. The calamities of fire or of decimation, even, however distressing in themselves, never yet ruined a country. No calamity ruins a country that leaves the surviving inhabitants to develop in their old circumstances their old character and resources. We feel at times that it is an advantage to have lived among the humbler people. We have been enabled in consequence to detect many such gross misstatements as those with which apologists of the disastrous revolution effected in Sutherland have attempted to gloss over the ruin of that country. In other parts of the Highlands, especially in the Hebrides, the failure of the kelp trade did much to impoverish the inhabitants, but in the Highlands of Sutherland the famine was an effect of improvement alone." He goes on to explain the Duchess Countess of Sutherland's previous generosity. Alas for poor Sutherland! There, it was said, the charity of the country was not required, as the noble and wealthy proprietors had themselves resolved to interfere, and as this statement was circulated extensively through the public prints and sedulously repeated at all the public meetings, the mind of the community was set quite at rest on the matter, and interfere the proprietors at length did. Late in the spring of 1837, after sufferings the most incredible had been endured, and disease and death had been among the wretched people, they received a scanty supply of meal and seed corn, for which, though vaunted at the time as a piece of munificent charity, the greater part of them had to afterwards pay. There were people other than the famed Donald MacLeod of Sutherland as well, who were willing to take the depopulating lords to task. Remember at the start I talked about the dukes penning open letters in order to explain away their actions or to detach themselves from any responsibility over the depopulation of the lands that they held. Thomas Mullock responded to Lord Macdonald with regards to the Solace trials. This is from the Inverness Advertiser and Rossshire Chronicle for September of 1849. "I assert, without fear of confutation, that your lordship's statements made through your vicegerent are wholly incorrect when you allege that Solace is not suited for small tenants, from the scarcity of manure and the nature of the soil. I maintain, on the contrary, from actual observation and inquiry, and from the written testimony of your lordship's former factor, Dr. MacLeod, that the experience of more than 70 years justifies the belief that the district of Solace is well suited for small tenants, if proper and reasonable encouragement were afforded them." Up to the years 1846, 1847 and 1848, the rents of Solace were as regularly paid, says Dr. MacLeod, as those of any other lands in North Uist, which can be proved from the factor's books. It is true that the potato failure threw the people of Solace, like all other Highland tenants, necessarily in arrear, and the absolute need of increased corn cultivation at once demonstrated the inadequacy of existing crops to supply subsistence for the population. But the real remedy for this distressing state of things lay with your lordship, who, by reducing rents and enlarging crofts, might have secured the continuance, after a period of difficulty, of a thriving and thankful tenantry. But other counsel prevailed, and Solace was foredoomed to depopulation in order that the district should be partitioned among 2 or 3 prospective tacksmen who had found favour with your lordship's functionaries, and I boldly affirm that these monstrously unjust prearrangements lie at the root of all the systematic clearances which disgrace and desolate the Highlands. In a letter signed MacDonald, now lying before me, your lordship states that the tenants of Solace some time ago petitioned to be sent to America. Their petition was taken into consideration, and, after considerable expense had been gone into for the purpose of carrying out their wishes, they draw back and say they will not move. Confiding as I do implicitly in your lordship's veracity, I must nevertheless plainly declare that your lordship has been made the victim of some unworthy trick, for on 2 occasions the whole of the heads of families at Solace emphatically assured me that they had never signed, never seen, never heard of any petition on the subject of emigration. I cannot yield to the supposition that 50 or 60 decent persons palmed a rank falsehood on me, and I therefore conclude that a sham petition was obtruded upon your lordship by interested parties, whose wish was father to the thought of compulsory emigration. As to the expenses it contracted to carry out this pretended petition, your lordship best knows to what extent your purse was drained to promote the ideal project, but one statement made by Mr. Cooper sounds to me very apocryphal, viz. that the proprietor had arranged to get assistance from the Highland Destitution Committee, to the extent of 20 shillings for each adult and 10 shillings for each person under 14 years of age. It being clearly your lordship's intention to effect a wholesale removal of the tenants at Solace, it was impossible that any bona fide arrangement could have been made with the Highland Destitution Committee. Because we spoke before about the article detailing their meeting, where they were emphatic that their contributions were to be made solely to the charitable purpose of saving the people. I mentioned a surprising statement at the start, courtesy of Punch magazine, where they had outed the Duke's dirty little secrets. But it wasn't the only surprise that this magazine was to give me. I have a bound collection of their publications for the year of 1857, and in September of 1857 they give us a poem entitled Kinreen of the Dee, which appears to be a lament of a Highlander forced to leave his ancestral lands. There aren't articles prior to it or thereafter that in any way detract from its message. It exists as a standalone poem, which was surprising for the publication it came from. I'll certainly include it in the post on rsh.scot for anyone that wants to give it a read. So, to finish, I do not like potatoes. I don't like the smell, the taste, or the texture of them. I've just always been that way, and I get that it's weird. I always had wondered, while learning at school, that a lack of potatoes were the reason that everyone fled the country. I always wondered why they didn't just resort to a different foodstuff, why they didn't replace it with something else. That we had already been taught that potatoes had been brought to Britain by Raleigh, say like 1739, 40-ish. And if you think that it's only like probably not even 50 years thereafter that the clearances started to happen, that people were being shifted from their lands, I had it in my head that there were still going to be people alive who remembered a time prior to potatoes, who would just be able to say to the others, it's okay, I've got this. We used to not have these things, and this is what we ate before, so we'll just eat this now. Having done this research, it has really secured in my head the fact that potatoes were an incredibly important crop to the population of the island. They needed less ground to produce far more food than the same extent of any other crop could produce. You also had their utility that they could be cooked in a variety of ways, fairly inexpensively, that they could be preserved over a good length of time because it could be turned into flour, etc. They could be dried. I understand why they became such an intrinsic part of the diet of the poor. So I'm no longer in doubt about that at all, despite my own potato prejudices. What you don't hear from the rest of the world is of other populations being quite so forcefully evicted due to anything approaching harvest failures. No one had a right to move people from their land. For your own researches, if you're at all interested in looking into the clearances further, you can find a sheer plethora of information using a very few useful search terms. So the words that you want to be focusing on are extirpate, extirpated, extirpation, the act of removing or destroying. A new word to me was deforce, deforcing, deforcement, which is to deprive someone wrongfully or forcefully of their rightful property. And of course, improvements and improving. These search terms will lead you to articles showing the real cause. Very few of these articles mention potatoes. So I could have filled this entire episode purely just with quotes from Donald MacLeod's Gloomy Memories, which specifically focuses on the Sutherlandshire clearances, although he has written so much on the topic that he really takes in all avenues and really investigates the reasons and effects. So I recommend Donald MacLeod's Gloomy Memories to anyone with an interest in this part of Scottish history. It's already been uploaded to rsh.scot. It was one of the first publications uploaded, and I think I've read it myself about 5 times now, so I can highly recommend it. But it's nice to get the varying testimonials from different newspapers, the contemporary press of the time, that really just serve to back up his claims in Gloomy Memories. So for the full articles and the resources that I've gleaned my information for this episode, I'll post it all to rsh.scot. It's a lot, so it will be in a few parts, and screenshots from the Punch magazine examples that I've mentioned. So I wish you all health, and we may see you again for the next one. Take care.